Imagine you are standing at the edge of a chasm. You need to get to the other side. The leap is possible, just barely, but you cannot know in advance whether you will make it. Here's the question. Does believing you can make the leap make it more likely that you will?
Most people's instinct is to say, the belief is irrelevant. Either you can make the jump or you cannot. The physics is the physics. What you believe about it does not change the distance.
William James thought that was wrong. And he thought it was wrong not just for athletic feats, but for a much broader category of human endeavor, including the most important question a person can face about whether life is worth living and whether the world is meaningful. His argument is one of the most controversial and most practically useful in the history of American philosophy.
Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Claire.
And I'm Shawn. Today we are talking about William James and American pragmatism, about what truth is, what belief is for, and whether there are cases where you are not only permitted but actually obligated to believe something before you have sufficient evidence to justify it. This is strange territory. It is also some of the most honest philosophy about the human condition ever produced. Big ideas, human conversations. Let's go.
William James was born in New York City in 1842. His family was extraordinary. His father, Henry James Sr., was an eccentric religious philosopher. His brother, Henry James, became one of the greatest novelists in the English language, and William himself moved between medicine, psychology, and philosophy, with a restlessness that was partly temperamental and partly a reflection of the genuinely unsettled intellectual landscape of the late 19th century.
He suffered from severe depression and philosophical crisis in his late 20s, a period of genuine darkness in which he questioned whether life was worth living at all, whether he had any real agency, whether the deterministic picture of the universe left room for anything he could recognize as a self. He emerged from that crisis partly through a decision, a choice to believe in free will as a kind of experiment, to act as if his choices mattered, to see what happened when he committed to that belief rather than waiting for certainty that never came.
That biographical episode is not incidental to his philosophy. It is the source of it. The will to believe is not an abstract theoretical claim. It is a description of what James himself did when he was at the edge of the chasm and needed to jump. The philosophy came from the life, and the life gave the philosophy a weight and urgency that purely academic work rarely has.
He taught at Harvard for most of his career, first as a physiologist, then as a psychologist. His Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, is still one of the most readable introductions to the subject ever written. And finally, as a philosopher, his major philosophical works include The Will to Believe, published in 1897, and Pragmatism, published in 1907. He died in 1910, having established a distinctly American philosophical tradition that was, in important ways, a direct response to the European academic philosophy he had encountered and found inadequate to the actual texture of human experience.
His colleagues and friends included Charles Sanders Peirce, who coined the term pragmatism, and whose logical rigor James both admired and sometimes loosened more than Peirce would have liked, and John Dewey, who took the pragmatist tradition in a more explicitly political and educational direction. Together they constitute the founding generation of American philosophy, a tradition that has been enormously influential and is still, I think, underread outside of academic philosophy.
I want to say a little more about the intellectual landscape James was responding to, because it matters for understanding why pragmatism took the shape it did. The late 19th century was a period of genuine philosophical crisis in the educated world. Darwin had published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and the implications were still reverberating. The traditional picture of a universe designed by God for human purposes, in which meaning was built into the structure of things, was under serious pressure. The scientific materialists picture a universe of matter in motion, governed by physical laws, with no inherent purpose or significance, seemed to many people to be closing in.
At the same time, the European philosophical tradition, Hegel, Kant, the German idealists offered a kind of salvation through abstraction, meaning and value preserved in the grand architecture of absolute mind or pure practical reason, but at the cost of becoming remote from actual human experience and actual human lives. James found both options inadequate. The scientific materialist picture seemed to leave out everything that made life worth living. The idealist picture preserved the right things, but in a form that felt bloodless and disconnected from the texture of daily experience. Pragmatism was his attempt to find a third way, one that took science seriously without surrendering to materialism, and that preserved meaning and value without retreating into abstraction.
Louis Menon's book, The Metaphysical Club, which is one of the most readable histories of American intellectual life ever written, tells the story of how pragmatism emerged from a specific group of thinkers in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1870s who were all grappling with the post-Civil War, post-Darwin intellectual situation. The club included Pierce, James, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and Chauncey Wright. They were trying to figure out what thinking was for, what truth was, what a philosophy adequate to modern experience would look like. Out of those conversations, over the following decades, came the pragmatist tradition. It is one of the great examples of philosophy emerging from lived circumstances rather than academic reflection alone.
Before we get to the will to believe specifically, I want to spend time on the pragmatist theory of truth, because it is the philosophical foundation that makes James's argument possible, and because it is itself one of the most interesting and most contested ideas in the history of philosophy. The classical theory of truth is correspondence. A belief is true if it corresponds to reality, if it matches how things actually are. The truth of the belief that there is coffee in the pot is determined by whether there is, in fact, coffee in the pot. Truth is out there, fixed, independent of what anyone believes or wants or needs. Our job is to discover it, not to make it.
James accepted this for a large class of beliefs, the everyday empirical ones, where correspondence to observable reality is exactly the right standard. But he thought the correspondence theory became strained and ultimately useless when applied to a different class of beliefs. Beliefs about God, about meaning, about the value of life, about what the universe is ultimately like. For these questions, there is no simple procedure of checking your belief against an observable fact. The question of whether life has meaning is not answerable by looking at the coffee pot.
James's alternative was a pragmatist theory of truth. A belief is true insofar as it works, insofar as it produces satisfactory practical consequences for the person who holds it and for the world. Truth is not a static relationship between a proposition and reality. It is a dynamic process beliefs become true, by leading us successfully through experience, by helping us navigate the world, by producing the results they promise. Truth is what it is good for us to believe.
That last formulation, truth, is what it is good for us to believe, is the one that generates the most objections, and I want to take the objections seriously rather than brush them aside. The obvious worry is that this collapses truth into convenience. If a belief is true because it is useful to hold it, then we can justify believing anything we find comforting, anything that serves our interests, anything that makes us feel good. Wishful thinking becomes epistemically respectable. The whole project of trying to believe what is actually the case falls apart.
James anticipated this objection and responded to it in ways that are not always satisfying, but are more careful than the criticism usually acknowledges. He did not think that any belief that happens to feel useful is true. He thought the pragmatic test was demanding that beliefs have to work not just in the immediate moment, but over time and across contexts, that they have to cohere with our other beliefs, that they have to survive encounter with the full range of experience rather than just the parts that confirm them. The useful belief is not the comfortable belief. It is the belief that actually helps you navigate reality more successfully.
Whether that response is fully adequate is a question philosophers are still debating. But it is worth keeping in mind as we move to the will to believe argument, because the argument depends on the pragmatist framework in specific ways that matter for understanding what James is and is not claiming. There is also something important in the way James understands the relationship between truth and action that is worth naming before we move on. For James, beliefs are not primarily mental representations of the world. They are habits of action, dispositions to behave in certain ways given certain circumstances. To believe that there is coffee in the pot is to be disposed to go to the pot when you want coffee. To believe that the universe has meaning is to be disposed to act as if it does, to invest in things, to maintain commitments, to treat the world as if effort matters and relationships are real. The pragmatist theory of truth is, at its core, a theory about what believing is for. It is for living, for acting, for navigating the world. And a truth that has no bearing on action is, in James's framework, a truth that has no bearing on anything at all.
That is a provocative claim, and it generates real philosophical disagreement. The mathematical truths of Cantor's transfinite cardinals, which we explored several episodes ago, do not bear on anyone's action in any obvious way. Are they truths? James would say yes, but he would have to explain how, and the explanation would require the pragmatist framework to accommodate theoretical truths in ways that are not entirely smooth. He was aware of this difficulty and worked on it without fully resolving it. The pragmatist theory of truth is richest and most convincing when applied to the domain of practical and existential beliefs, the ones that actually make a difference to how a life is lived. It is more strained when applied to abstract theoretical domains. The Will to Believe essay was originally a lecture James gave to philosophy clubs at Yale and Brown in 1896. It is one of the most carefully constructed and most misread pieces in American philosophy. Let me try to lay out the argument precisely, because the precision matters.
James begins by distinguishing between different types of decisions. Some decisions can be postponed, you can gather more evidence, wait and see, suspend judgment. But some decisions are what James calls forced, you cannot avoid making them. If someone says, either accept this truth or go without it, there is no third option. You are either believing or not believing. And for these forced decisions, refusing to decide is itself a decision. The agnostic who says, I will wait for more evidence, has, in the meantime, chosen to live without the belief and to act accordingly.
He also distinguishes between live and dead hypotheses. A live hypothesis is one that actually appeals to you as a genuine possibility, one that has at least some credibility in your mind, that you could actually imagine believing. A dead hypothesis is one that seems so implausible that it does not even register as a live option. For most Western readers, the hypothesis that Thor is the thunder god is dead. The hypothesis that there is some kind of transcendent meaning in the universe may be live, genuinely open, genuinely up for grabs.
And then he distinguishes between momentous and trivial decisions. A momentous option is one where the stakes are high, where getting it right matters enormously, and where missing the opportunity to choose correctly would be a significant loss. A trivial option is one where it does not matter much which way you decide.
James's claim is this: when a decision is forced, live, and momentous, when you cannot avoid making it, when both options are genuinely alive to you, and when the stakes are high, then it can be legitimate to let your passional nature, your emotional and volitional commitments, determine your belief. In those specific circumstances, waiting for sufficient intellectual evidence is not neutrality. It is a choice to err on one particular side, and that choice has costs.
He applies this most directly to religious belief. The question of whether there is a God, whether the universe has meaning, whether human life participates in something larger than itself. This is, he argues, a forced, live, and momentous option for many people. You cannot wait indefinitely. You are either living as if it is true or living as if it is not. And if it happens to be true, if the universe really is the kind of place in which that belief is accurate, then the person who withheld belief in the name of intellectual caution has lost something real. They have forfeited whatever goods come from living in genuine relationship with that truth.
The essay's most direct target is W.K. Clifford, a British mathematician and philosopher who argued in 1877 that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Clifford's position, sometimes called evidentialism, holds that intellectual integrity requires that your beliefs track your evidence, and that believing beyond the evidence, however emotionally satisfying, is an epistemic and moral failure. James calls this the agnostic rule, and he argues that it is itself a passional stance, a commitment to the value of avoiding error above the value of gaining truth, that is no more rationally grounded than its opposite.
That is a subtle and important move. James is not saying that evidence does not matter. He is saying that both Clifford's principle and its opposite are, at root, expressions of what you care about most, whether you weight the risk of believing something false more heavily or the risk of failing to believe something true. Neither of those weights is itself determined by the evidence. They are prior commitments. And once you see that, the evidentialism Clifford is defending loses its claim to be the uniquely rational position.
Let me go back to the chasm image from the opening, because I think it is the most useful way to see what James is actually arguing and where it applies.
The chasm case is one where belief and outcome are genuinely related, where what you believe about your capacity affects what your capacity actually is. If you believe you cannot make the jump, your muscles tighten, your form deteriorates, your commitment falters, and you are more likely to fall. If you believe you can make it, the full resources of your body and mind are available to the attempt. The belief is not magic. The leap is still physically possible or not, but the belief is a genuine causal factor in the outcome.
James calls these cases where faith in a fact can help create the fact, and he argues that a great deal of human experience falls into this category. The belief that you can recover from illness affects the probability of recovery. The belief that a negotiation can be successful affects the quality of your engagement in it. The belief that a relationship can survive a serious rupture affects how much effort you bring to repairing it. In all these cases, the belief is not simply a neutral map of an independent terrain. It is a factor in producing the terrain.
And he extends this controversially to the social and moral domain. He argues that trusting people creates the conditions for trustworthy behavior. The person who withholds trust until they have sufficient evidence for trustworthiness is less likely to receive it, because their withholding communicates distrust that then produces untrustworthy behavior. The belief comes first, the evidence follows. In social life, as in the chasm, sometimes you have to jump before you know whether the landing will hold.
This is where James's argument is most powerful and also most dangerous. Powerful because it captures something genuinely true about the structure of human relationships and human endeavors, that commitment and risk are often required before the evidence that would justify them is available. Dangerous because it can be used to justify any belief that is emotionally compelling, any commitment that you really want to make, regardless of whether it actually has the self-fulfilling character James is describing.
The cases where the will to believe applies legitimately are specific. The belief has to be one where holding it genuinely affects the outcome. Religious belief in a transcendent meaning, trust in a relationship, confidence in your own capacities under pressure. These are cases where the connection between the believing and the outcome is real. The belief that your investment in a company will produce returns, the belief that a person who has repeatedly betrayed your trust will this time be reliable. These are not the same structure. In those cases, James's argument does not apply, and wishful thinking is just wishful thinking.
The philosopher who has done the most careful work distinguishing the legitimate and illegitimate applications of the will to believe argument is probably John Hick, who developed an account of religious belief that takes seriously the epistemological structure of faith, without collapsing into mere wishful thinking. His concept of religious experience as an interpretive act, a way of perceiving reality that is neither purely objective nor purely subjective, is a more developed version of the territory James was first mapping.
The social trust example is worth developing further, because I think it is the most practically important application of the will to believe in everyday life. Trust is not simply a response to evidence about someone's reliability. It is itself a productive force in relationships. When you extend trust to someone, when you act as if they are trustworthy, before you have complete evidence that they are, you create a relational context in which trustworthy behavior is more likely to emerge. Not because your trust is magical, but because it communicates something about how you see the other person. And people tend to live up to how they are seen by people who matter to them.
Conversely, the withholding of trust, even when justified by past evidence, tends to produce the outcome it is predicting. If you treat someone as untrustworthy, you communicate that expectation, and the relationship contracts in response. The evidence of untrustworthiness that follows then seems to confirm the initial skepticism, when in fact the skepticism was partly producing what it was predicting. This is not an argument for naive trust that ignores genuine evidence of bad faith. It is an argument that in the domain of human relationships, as in the chasm, the courage to commit before certainty is available is often the condition for the good outcome, not just a bet on it.
I want to spend the last substantive section on what I think James genuinely got right, because the will to believe is often taught primarily as an object of criticism, as an example of motivated reasoning, dressed up in philosophical language. And I think that framing misses something important.
What James got right, most fundamentally, is that the pure evidentialist picture of human belief is a fiction. We do not form beliefs simply by looking at evidence and computing the most probable conclusion. Our beliefs are shaped by our prior commitments, our emotional investments, our sense of what matters, our fear of certain conclusions. This is not a failure of rationality that could be corrected with sufficient discipline. It is a structural feature of how human minds work. The cognitive bias research we covered earlier in this show is essentially a detailed empirical confirmation of what James was arguing on philosophical grounds in the 1890s.
And given that our passional natures are always already shaping our beliefs, the question is not whether to let them do so. They are doing so regardless. The question is whether we are honest about it, whether we acknowledge the commitments and investments that are structuring our epistemic situation, and whether we are reflective about which of those commitments are serving us well and which are distorting our perception of reality.
James is also right that there is a specific class of beliefs where the relationship between believing and the reality being believed in is genuinely bidirectional. The self-fulfilling belief is a real phenomenon, one that psychology has documented extensively under the name of the self-fulfilling prophecy, and that philosophy of action has explored through the concept of performative utterances and constitutive commitments. When you promise, you are not just predicting your future behavior, you are partly creating it. When you commit to a relationship, you are not just betting on an existing state of affairs. You are helping to bring that state of affairs into existence.
The deepest thing James got right, I think, is about the cost of intellectual cowardice dressed up as rigor. The person who refuses to commit to anything they cannot fully justify by evidence is not being admirably rational. They are being, in a specific way, cowardly, avoiding the risk of being wrong by avoiding the kind of investment that makes life meaningful. Frankel's will to meaning, which we discussed last week, is in this respect a continuation of James's will to believe. Both are arguing that the risk of investing yourself in something before you have certainty is not just acceptable but necessary. The withholding of commitment is not neutrality. It is a choice to live a smaller, more defended, less fully inhabited life.
That is a genuinely important claim, and it lands differently depending on where you are in your life. For someone in the grip of the kind of paralyzing doubt James himself experienced in his late 20s, unable to act, unable to commit, unable to find a reason to continue the will to believe is not a philosophical trick. It is a lifeline. The permission to believe that your life matters, that your choices have consequences, that the world is the kind of place where genuine effort is worth something that permission, taken seriously, can be the beginning of genuine change.
There is a connection here to the Aristotelian account of virtue that I find genuinely illuminating. Aristotle argued that you become courageous by doing courageous acts, that the disposition precedes the full development of the virtue, and that you have to act as if you already have the virtue in order to develop it. James is making a parallel claim about belief. You become capable of a certain kind of engaged, committed, meaningful life by acting as if it is possible before you have certainty that it is. The belief enables the practice that eventually justifies the belief. The sequence is not belief from evidence, but belief toward evidence, belief as the starting point of an experience that then either confirms or disconfirms it.
And that is genuinely different from wishful thinking. Wishful thinking is static, you believe what you want to be true and then leave it there, without submitting it to experience. The will to believe, in James's framework, is dynamic. You commit to a belief, you act on it. You stay open to what the experience of acting on it reveals, and you are prepared to revise if the experience consistently fails to confirm. The belief is a starting point, not a conclusion. And the willingness to hold it as a starting point, to take the risk of commitment, is not irrationality. It is a specific kind of epistemic courage that James thought was not only permissible but necessary for a fully lived human life.
Coming off the Frankel episode, I find James and Frankel sitting very naturally together. Both are philosophers of the will, not in the heavy Schopenhauerian sense, but in the practical sense of arguing that how you orient yourself toward your situation, what you commit to, what you choose to believe about the world and about yourself, is not merely a reflection of how things are. It is partly constitutive of how things become.
The combination of the two episodes also clarifies something about the examined life that I think is easy to miss. When we talk about the philosophical life as a life of honest examination, of not letting comfortable fictions stand unchallenged, of always asking whether you actually believe what you say you believe, there is a risk of reading that as a demand for permanent skepticism, for withholding commitment until certainty arrives. James and Frankel are both arguing that this is not what the examined life requires. The examined life requires honesty about your commitments, not the absence of them.
You have to believe something. You are always already believing something. The question is whether you believe it with your eyes open, whether you know that you are making a commitment that goes beyond what the evidence strictly warrants, that you are trusting the jump before you know whether the landing will hold, and whether you take responsibility for that commitment, rather than pretending it was simply forced on you by the facts. That is, I think, the deepest thing this episode is about. Not the will to believe as a license to believe whatever you want, but the recognition that the fully examined life is not a life of suspended judgment. It is a life of committed judgment, judgment that knows its own limits, that holds its commitments with appropriate humility, that remains genuinely open to revision, but that commits, that acts, that does not wait for certainty that will never come before it consents to be fully alive.
James said that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. That is not a guarantee. It is not a promise that belief produces reality on demand. It is the more modest and more important claim that the quality of your inner life, what you are willing to commit to, what you believe about yourself and the world, is not simply a reflection of your circumstances. It is one of the forces shaping them, and that is worth taking seriously. James struggled with depression and crisis for years before he found his footing. His philosophy was built in the wake of that struggle, not before it. And I think that gives it a texture that purely academic philosophy often lacks a quality of having been tested against something real. The will to believe is not a clever argument. It is a hard-won position about what makes human life livable. And even if you ultimately disagree with parts of it, and there are parts worth disagreeing with the basic insight, that commitment and risk are prior to evidence in the domains that matter most, is one of the more honest things in the philosophical tradition.
Next week, we are moving into the strange and certain pillar, the paradoxes of Zeno, not as curiosities, but as genuine philosophical problems that took 2,000 years to resolve, and whose resolution reveals something deep about infinity, motion, and the nature of mathematical reality. Achilles cannot catch a tortoise. An arrow in flight is always at rest. Neither of these is a trick. Both are genuine philosophical problems, and working through them is one of the most satisfying things philosophy can do.
If this episode made you think differently about a commitment you have been withholding, share it with someone who might need the permission to jump. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for.
Sources and further reading are in the show notes.
We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Sunday.
Big ideas, human conversations.
See you next week.